How can you communicate with groups or communities that distrust and dislike you in a conflict context? Well, arguably it's not an easy task, but the first step is to realize that communicating across a chasm of mistrust is very different than communicating with individuals within your group that see you as a respected leader. One of the blind spots that people in power often have is that they underestimate how much other people dislike them. So it's common to feel like you're just speaking to someone as part of a group that you all belong to and that you represent, when they're seeing you as a distrusted outsider from the city, in a country, from region A when they're in region B. And so when you're oblivious to their mistrust, you can never just defeat the suspicion that they're bringing to this interaction. Once you've realized that there's a problem, the way that a number of politicians that frequently respond is by labeling and condemning the distrusting group. Now, this may seem like an obvious point, but it doesn't actually build trust or communicate positive messages effectively. So, for example, it's common to speak of the problem of violence in such and such a community, the problem of destructive behavior among these types of people. Perhaps there's certain young people or certain immigrant groups that are identified as a problem. That kind of labeling and stigmatizing language has little evidence to support it as a behavior change technique. Effective persuasion often requires drawing the boundary more inclusively and explicitly articulating the ways in which you relate to other people as part of a group that you value, that you see as similar, and that you feel is represented in your own community and values. So by drawing that boundary inclusively, you're bringing people towards you in a way that may make them more open to your message. But you have to do it explicitly, because when it's left unaddressed, the suspicion, cynicism, and conflict of the past may prevent people from realizing that you're trying to relate to them positively in the present. Even after you've identified inclusively with a community, to overemphasize the negative behavior or the problem has little evidence to support it. So what we usually find in social psychology is that if you say, for example, Australians have a problem with unhealthy eating, or they're not saving enough for their retirement, or there's a problem of environmental waste and habitat destruction, those messages actually don't motivate people to change. What we find instead is that that can reduce people's intentions to change, or even increase their commitment to whatever the problem behavior is that you just identified. Now, that is so counterintuitive for many policymakers and campaigners to hear that they sometimes can't even believe the message. Why is that? Because this is a message that would motivate themselves. So sometimes we say campaigners are designing, policymakers are designing interventions that would work for them. It turns out there's one group of people that will be motivated by a negative message, people that already are passionate that there's a problem and that they're committed to the solution. When they hear about a negative message in that context, they hear it as a call to arms, that there's a need for action, and that they're committed to change. But everyone else hears it as a sort of, oh, well then, right? The message is out there, the problem's out there, oh, well then Australians are like that, I'm Australian, I'm going to react in that same way. So overstressing a negative norm is a counterproductive tactic for behavior change. In addition to those problems that I've talked about, overstressing the negative norm and ignoring the distrust that people have, there's a third problem, which is I'm going to talk about in psychological terms. I'm going to call it opinion group identities. Now, an opinion group identity is an identity that you have as a supporter or opponent of a political issue. I might say I'm pro-Brexit, you're anti-Brexit. I might say I'm pro-regulation of habitat clearing, of land clearing in Queensland, and you oppose it. Now, we all have various identities around various opinions. They don't become important to us in our everyday life in normal circumstances, but they do become important when there's an ongoing conflict. When that happens, as soon as the issue comes up, we immediately know who we are and what our stance is. So simply mentioning the word in Australia, Murray-Darling Basin, this incredibly contentious area of environmental conflict and policy debate, can lead people to have an opinion group identity as a supporter or opponent of this policy that dominates their decision-making from the time that the issue is raised. So that slows the pace of change by preventing people from being able to hear each other And that can create a problem for policymakers and leaders who are trying to mobilize a change and a consensus for change. The 5 solutions for those 3 problems are focusing on groups, not individuals, recognizing them explicitly, defining the problem group narrowly and including your audience in our side, focusing on positive change instead of the negativity in the present, using speakers that are in a trust relationship to the community you're relating to, and rewarding the moderates on their side that are moving towards you instead of driving them away. So let's just take each of those points in turn. First, as we've highlighted, we need to recognize when there's a problem of mistrust, but do that in a way that invites our audience to share with us common identities and values and to acknowledge the things we have in common. By doing that explicitly, you're able to create a trust relationship for your message, at the same time as you identify a problem group who should not be related to the audience that's listening to you. So for example, when people feel like there's a problem with land clearing, it might be tempting to say that all Australians are responsible for this problem, or perhaps all farmers are responsible for this problem. But these broad framings have little bearing on the actual source of the problem and the possibility of change. Many farmers that might be clearing now had not been clearing a decade ago and won't be clearing a decade in the future. So having an eye to that change and identifying the audience inclusively will allow you to speak persuasively in a conflict context in a way that labeling and stigmatizing will not. Having an eye to that positive change in the future usually requires you to widen the time horizon from the conflict in the present. At this moment in time, you and your opponent are on opposite sides, but in 10 years they will have agreed with you and you will both be doing that positive change. We will both be owning that change, we will both be committed to that change. If you think ahead to that time and act as if it's already here, you're going to relate to the people that you're talking to in a more open, positive, and respectful way, and that'll enable them to hear you. Having said that, the conflict context sometimes is so intense that the trust barriers are greatly assisted when you are not the person that delivers the message. There's a tendency for leaders to resist the idea that it shouldn't be them to speak, or policymakers and bureaucrats may sometimes feel that for branding purposes, the message has to go out from their organization. But that can be a barrier to effective change. Sometimes it would actually be better for the same campaign or message to be released or given voice to by a different person who's an insider in that community, who agrees with the message, but who has the trust and respect of the audience. I call this approach the chain of trust, the idea that instead of focusing on what to say, put the focus on who should say it, give the message away to people inside the trusted community so that the message will be heard in a way that's effective rather than rejected or dismissed out of hand. And last, reward the moderates. So there's a view sometimes that if someone comes one step towards you, that the best thing to do is to identify the fact that they're not there yet and that their behavior still isn't good enough. But there's really little evidence from a psychological perspective to identify that as a positive dynamic. It can feel very rejecting. It can feel like a negative experience to have someone say that you're not good enough and that you're 90% of the way not there. By focusing on the 10% that you have in common strategically, you reward someone and bring them towards you. And there's a psychological basis to argue that that will lead to behavior change faster than if every time they get part of the way there, you criticize them.